So we'll make a start. Welcome to the first meeting of the new Cabinet Housing Committee. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Claire Hughes and I'm the Director of Governance and Customer Services. This meeting is being streamed live to the Cheltenham Borough Council YouTube channel. So if you ask a question at the meeting, you will be deemed to have consented to being filmed and the possible use of those images and sound recordings for broadcasting and/or training purposes. Please note that a fire alarm test is not expected, so if the alarm does sound, please make your way to the nearest exit. So we'll just move to the first item of business on the agenda, which is the election of chair and vice chair. So if I could invite nominations for chair, please. Councillor Kuklus.
I'm Julian as chair, please. Sorry, did you hear me? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Any other nominations? No? In that case, congratulations, Councillor Took. Do you want to come and take the chair and you can take over the meeting?
There
you go.
I think that's working now. So before we start, first of all, thank you. Thank you for nominating me. And I'm really... It keeps going off. I got a couple of thoughts just to frame it, but I think as we get to know each other better, you know, we'll end up redefining what this meeting is and making it better and better, hopefully. But just two thoughts, really, to start off. One, this is a work in progress, as I was saying, you know, so we need to keep working at this meeting to make it as good as possible. Secondly, two things to think about are, one, I don't think we're CBC or we're CBH when we're doing this role. We're a separate set of eyes, you know, to look at everything. And, you know, I think we need to be aware of that, scrutinise hard. That's our job to do. You know, be that critical friend. So we're not CBC, we're not the ex-CBH, we're ourselves. And we'll do a good job, I'm sure. Secondly, it's a kind of plea not to make this about buildings, because I don't think it is about buildings. I think it's about homes, and it's about people's homes. And this is all about people. So we should remember all times, you know, this is about people's homes and the people that live in them and doing a good job for them. And I think that's absolutely critical. So you're in agreement. I think that's a kind of good way to start thinking about it, but we'll kind of develop that as we go along. So moving on to the business, I'd like to invite nominations for the vice chair of the committee, Richard Pinniger.
Yeah,
I nominate Richard Pinniger. I think that's carried. Okay, you're happy there? Okay, the next item is apologies. We haven't got any apologies yet,
not here.
but we are missing Councillor Jan Foster and we're missing Bozena Tanavska. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. So hopefully they'll arrive soon. So we're two short. Third item is declarations of interest. Would any members like to state any interests?
My wife is currently employed as Health and Wellbeing Coordinator for the west of Cheltenham by the Springbank Centre.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, could I just check that when we were on the Cheltenham Borough Homes Board, it was stated very clearly that being a tenant was not did not need to be declared as an interest because you are working on behalf of all tenants. So I just wanted to check that that remains the case
I think that
this
remains the
committee?
case.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's why we talked about members having interests as opposed to everyone else. But thank you for pointing that out. That's a good point. Next point is public and member questions. So anything that's come from the public, calls for actions and petitions. Just to confirm that members of the public and members are entitled to submit questions to the meeting 7 working days in advance of the meeting. Now, I don't think we had any in advance of the meeting. I know Councillor Pinniger had got some questions, but if you could drop those in later when we get to the right bit, would that work for you? Brilliant, thank you. The next point was about the regulator for the social housing, the consumer standards update. Now, the point of this was to provide a high-level overview of compliance with the regulator's consumer standards, and we know there was new legislation that came through in April, and the development of an improvement plan to resolve areas of non-compliance. I know that, can I call you Caroline? Yeah, I know that Caroline is going to be talking about that, but Gareth Edmondson, our CEO of CBC, would like to say some words too.
Thank you, Chair. If you just indulge me for a couple of minutes, I thought it was important to set a little bit of context in advance of Caroline's presentation around the consumer standards specifically. And that is just to sort of look back at where we've come from and then a little bit of looking forward when we look at the papers that are on tonight's agenda that set out the current position that we find ourselves in. So, as many of you know, Cheltenham Borough Homes historically delivered and managed CBC's housing for the best part of 2 decades. Outwardly, when you look at the performance of that organisation, it would have told you that this was a high-performing organisation in the measures that were presented back to tenants, leaseholders, shareholders. And this was also confirmed when we did an external review of the ALMO in 2020-2021. They also confirmed that this was a well-functioning organisation that the council should retain. However, as part of the October 2023 Cabinet report, we stated that a key reason for bringing housing services back under the direct management and oversight of CBC was to ensure that we could ensure safety and compliance by taking that direct management over. And that was also in light of the new regulations that we were expecting. As part of that transfer exercise that has been undertaken, we have conducted an extensive due diligence exercise as part of that transfer, because it's really important that we are clear about where the organisation sits, and so we can accurately represent ourselves to the regulator. As part of that due diligence exercise, it has revealed that there are areas of improvement that we need to make, particularly around the areas of safety and compliance. And you will see in the reports that are in front of you this evening that there are areas of improvements that we do need to make. One of those areas being particularly around how we address overdue fire actions that have been identified as part of the regular fire risk assessments that we carry out. And as a result of the fact that we, at this point, cannot demonstrate our full safety and compliance according to the regulator, as a result of that, we have decided to make a self-referral to the regulator to transparently set out where we think we need to improve and, importantly, how we will address it. So as you will see in the paperwork that you have in front of you, and particularly the performance reports, which I hope will be a key area of interest for this committee going forward, to look at the performance of how we manage our homes. Ultimately, you will notice there are some properties at present that we cannot demonstrate our 100% compliance and meet that safety standard. And so I think it's important to say and as a demonstration of how seriously we take the matter of health, safety and compliance, it's important to apologise to those tenants living in those homes where we cannot currently evidence that we have got 100% compliance. And I want to just make a statement to absolutely give my 100% assurance that this organisation takes matters of health, safety and compliance and providing good, decent, safe homes very, very seriously. And what you will see already in the performance reports that you have in front of you, that we have already started taking significant action to address those areas where we have not made full compliance. And going forward, I think it's important for me to state that as an organisation, we are all in agreement that our aim is to deliver excellent homes and be an exemplar housing provider to the sector. We want to be the best out there. And that is the target that we will be working collectively to. And we welcome your role as a housing committee in that endeavour. Because not only do we want to work as hard as possible to address all the areas of compliance where we need to improve currently, but once we've completed that, we want to continue to challenge ourselves to improve the service that we offer, so we demonstrate the very best to the sector. And so I just thought it was important just to set that out initially, to give a little bit of context and to bring it together. I think ultimately, when I look back at housing management over the last few years, we have had hundreds of dedicated officers working tirelessly on trying to maintain and look after our housing stock and the homes that are there for our residents. But the one thing that the new regulatory environment for me has brought into sharp focus is that activity is not a substitute for evidence. And I think that from this point, you have my assurance as Chief Executive and you have the assurance of officers sitting with me that we will do our absolute utmost to ensure that we do exactly as you said, Chair. We are making sure these homes that people live in are well maintained, looked after, safe and compliant, and that will be at the heart of everything that we do. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that working now? Yeah. And actually, going back to our point of us as a committee, we expect to see evidence, and we should be given evidence. And if we don't understand the evidence, there are no stupid questions. You know, we say we don't understand, and if we don't understand, it's not because we're stupid, it's because it's not being explained properly to us. So I see the kind of review of the evidence and us really getting to grips with it and really understanding it as something really important that we can do, you know, to help everyone who lives in those homes. So we're going to take questions. Shall we take them at the end after Caroline Walker, who's our Head of Community Services, has talked through the report in more detail? Thank you, Caroline.
So the slides that I've prepared for you tonight give a broad overview of the consumer standards. There are 4 clear standards that we as a council need to meet. And Rhian, can you move on to so I can explain better? So what we've done is created a gap, is carried out a gap analysis against each of those standards, because effectively each standard has outcomes that the regulator requires and a set of requirements that sit below those outcomes. So we've analysed against each of those outcomes whether we're meeting those standards, whether we're partially meeting those standards, or whether we're not meeting those standards. And in normal tradition, we've used red, amber, green to express that. So the whole process has included making sure we educate ourselves by attending regulator workshops, making sure managers and team leaders across the housing teams have been engaged in this process. And basically we've assessed each standard, identified the gaps and captured the improvements. And to move on. So as Gareth alluded to in his introduction, the area of greatest concern is the safety and quality standard, which is driven by the need to deliver compliant properties that meet health and safety standards. And intrinsic to this standard is up-to-date stock condition surveys. So we're in the process of delivering those stock condition surveys at the present time. So until those are, we've reached a critical mass of those, it's very difficult for us to meet a number of the sub-outcomes that sit below that. I won't say any more about this at this stage because there's a much more detailed paper coming later in the agenda which will cover this in more detail. So moving on to the next one. So the next standard is around transparency, influence and accountability. And this standard is all about our relationship with our tenants and that includes communication. The standards of behaviour that we deliver to our tenants and also the quality of information we provide. We are partially meeting the number of those standards and the actions, examples of which are included in the right-hand side of the slides, are captured in the improvement plan for us to deliver. And I should say for future housing committee meetings, we'll bring the improvement plan to you so you can see the progress we're making against each of those actions. There are some areas that we are currently meeting the standards, but we won't be complacent. We need to continually work at those and continually evidence that the quality of information, our understanding of tenants as individuals, and our ability to manage containers is continually improving and continually meeting the standards we're required to meet. Similarly, with the neighbourhood and community standard, we're pretty much meeting about half of that standard. One of the key areas that we are relatively strong, although future agenda items I've got more to discuss on this, is that our response to ASB is generally strong, but we've got more work to do on deterring ASB and preventing it happening in the first place. And we've also got a piece of work to do with other housing providers in Cheltenham around how shared spaces are managed. So those are areas that aren't just one landlord, that they're shared across a number of landlords. So those are areas that we're going to be working on as part of the improvement plan. And finally, the tenancy standard. This is, again, an area of strength for the council. We're generally strong against these standards and are generally updating our policy and evidence against that policy to make sure we continue to be in that position. So in terms of next steps from our gap analysis, as I've already mentioned, we're very much starting to prioritise and identify capacity to deliver the improvement plan. As Gareth mentioned, we're in engagement with the regulator for social housing. And although we're in a position of self-referring at the moment, we're obviously hoping that will be a partnership going forward to help us improve. And we've also secured resources, both in terms of my colleague Dean here, who is an expert in property compliance, and an external resource from an organisation called Pennington's to help us achieve real excellence in property compliance. So we've started the process of external review with Pennington's and are waiting for their initial report by the end of this week. That's all I want to say at this stage. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Good, lots of questions. Ian, you okay with me calling you Ian? Absolutely. And Ian, would you like to go first?
Yes, I will. As Caroline has said, there are quite a lot of papers coming later in the meeting which go into these things in a lot more detail. So I think I'll save any detailed questions for later on. I just want to make one general point, and I have got one slightly technical question that I'd like to ask. The first time that I really heard what the regulator was expecting in detail was when I attended a conference in November of last year. And I attended that with CBH's former governance officer, And despite the fact that we had been working on these new regulations for about 2 years, we came out of that meeting saying we need to look at this again, because what they are expecting of board members in the case of housing associations or management companies, and what they're expecting of councillors is way above what we could have anticipated based on the pre-2010 regulations. And so I feel that I was a little bit of a Dr. Death, a sort of a prophet of doom, saying, oh, you've got to take this seriously. And I just wanted to say that this gap analysis was the first time that I felt reassured that we were actually taking this really seriously. And we were taking a very long, unflinching look at what we do well and what we didn't do so well. And I'm reminded of an old quotation which our governance officer looked up for me and turned out to be Socrates. It is important for wisdom to know what you don't know. And that's what this does for us, in my opinion, that we know the things that we don't know. We know where we are falling short, and we can be transparent and open with the regulator, not pretend everything's wonderful, but to actually say, we think we know where we're falling down, we think we know where we need to be, and we want to get there, but we don't want to compromise business as usual while we're doing it. The slightly technical question I wanted to ask, and I know Paul Leo isn't here, but the last time we spoke, the plan was to bring all the data that we hold into the QL management system, whereas previously a lot of that information had been held on separate spreadsheets outside of QL. And bringing it all together in one place would allow us to manage that information better. Can I ask, where are we on that process? Do we still have information on random spreadsheets dotted around, or is it all now, all the information that we do have in the QL system?
Work in progress. A great deal of focus over the last few months has been to set up the system infrastructure to be able to automatically collate the stock condition surveys. So that's a fundamental part of the data we're collecting. In a completely honest answer is we've got more to do in bringing other data onto the QL system where possible, but it's a very live and active line of work for us at the moment.
Just to add to that, we are taking a report to Appointments and Remuneration Committee tomorrow that is specifically related to ensuring that we've got dedicated officer resource in-house to look at the development of systems like QL that will precisely do bringing things together and improving that QL system. So we are moving away from separate spreadsheets.
And can we see a copy of that at this committee? The report that is coming to the committee you mentioned?
And that's an exempt report, but we hope to publish the minutes of that discussion. And I'm happy to sort of share the outcome, and you'll see that moving forward.
Could I just add one thing, building on that? Caroline, is it a people block or is it a systems block? And if it's a people block, i.e. people don't like using that system for whatever reason, can they be encouraged to use it? And second thing is, what can we get the most important data on there first? So, about health and safety, for instance. So you've got that all in one place.
Yeah, it's both. It's one of those systems where you have to continually work to understand its potential. And as Gareth mentioned, having a specialist resource will really help us move forward and address both those barriers.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Just to Just to add to that, there is a significant piece of work we're just kicking off to make sure that we have all the data we need against both the homes and the tenants to make sure we can evidence compliance. So there's a lot of work on all the existing data we've got, but also making sure we've got, where we haven't got data, that we start gathering the data we need to make sure we can evidence compliance going forward.
Put it in the system. Brilliant. Thank you.
Got it, sorry, got it. Okay. A lot of estates were built years ago by Cheltenham Borough Council, or at Cheltenham Borough Council's request, whatever. And obviously a lot of people have then sort of gone on to buy those properties. So if there's something seen as a problem with those properties, will that be shared with the private residents as well?
If it's part of a leasehold block and you've got residents in there where essentially we are in a block where we own some of the properties and we are effectively responsible for the maintenance of that block, then yes. If it is, I suppose, an individual home that's a private home that's just sitting on an estate, then no, because in a sense that's just an individual home.
As I say, but a lot of these estates, I mean, I'm thinking about where I live as well, which was built as a council estate. And obviously we bought from the people who bought, we didn't buy from the council. But there are properties that I've sort of noticed recently that have gone, somebody obviously thought it's a good thing. Oh yeah, I'll buy the council place and it'll be okay, like, you know. But you can see it's really, really gone downhill. So then that property is a liability for the people surrounding it. So if you sort of like, if you come along and you say, right, we're going to update that one, but that one's, we can't do anything with that one, then that property is going to cause problems for the ones that you've just updated because it's a mess for whatever reason. Sorry to confuse things.
I think it's best if we sort of pull this a bit outside of this meeting and we're talking the specifics of areas of properties. I think I've given you the kind of general answer about our approach to the homes under our ownership. And I think if we have a specific conversation where we can talk about those specific examples, there might be other routes in the council around, it might fall in other departments if there is houses falling into disrepair and various other things that are in a private ownership. But I think that's probably the best way to understand by examples about how we would, specific examples about how we would respond.
Richard. Okay. Flo.
Just to say, Gareth and Suzanne, some of that work is already being looked at and done in particular areas. So I'm happy if we can have a chat outside of this meeting and give you the information you need. Secondly, within the documentation, there's talk of the tenant's handbook. You're going to be sick to death of this, and so are you, Rowena. But the tenant's handbook has to be readable, it has to be accessible, it has to have a reading age, and it has to have information that tenants can understand without needing a degree, as we do for these, in order to understand it. So what we're looking at is a tenant's handbook that will tell them what we are doing, but I think it also needs to give them information on what we expect from them. So, for example, access to properties for fire safety and other issues. That has to be something that they understand they have to do. And I think if we have that in a handbook that is readable and accessible, it will help enormously.
Yeah, so just to give a bit of reassurance, there is a whole piece of work going on about completely redoing the tenant handbook. So all of those things will be taken into consideration, including making sure it's at the at a standard that is accessible for everybody and understandable by everybody. So yeah, that's an ongoing piece of work.
Ian.
Yeah, could I come back on what Flo has just said? I think we also need to recognise that a significant cohort of our tenants and our residents are not literate and don't have a functional level of literacy. Is it possible this could be available in an audio format or something of that nature, so that people who do not have a functional level of literacy are still able to be involved? It's not that they're stupid, they've got good points to make, but they can't understand what's being put in front of them. And also, can I just make the point, which I think people who remember me from the CPH board will know, I am a bit of a broken record on this. We have tenants whose first language is not English, who, and the lady I'm thinking of has a disabled husband with dementia and needs adaptations and whatever made to the property, and it keeps coming through in enormous long-winded letters in English. And it reminds me of that thing where you sort of say, if you can't speak English, please read this, ring this number. You know, they can't understand. Yeah, if we could do something for those people for whom English is not their first language, that would be great. I also just want to pick up one of the lesser-known features of the new social housing regulation bills is it puts additional obligations onto residents, not just gives them additional say or additional powers. It does put additional responsibilities on tenants. So it is in there somewhere. Not a lot of people have read it, but it's there.
And just suggest that actually GCHQ have offered to help in the past with languages, and it might be worthwhile contacting them to see if they would help with translations.
Can I just say thank you to both of you? We're absolutely in agreement. So we've got 3 takeouts. One is that we have the handbook, which is in clean, easy to understand English, and it should also include something about obligations. Secondly, that we have a kind of accessible version in audio for people who may struggle with reading. The third thing is that we look to translate where necessary, and maybe GCHQ could work in partnership with us on that. Thank you. That was really useful.
It's something that's very relevant at the moment in time, and I apologise if it's not good for this part of the meeting. But I was spoken to today by some residents who live in the bungalows on our estate, which are predominantly CBH or CBC, whatever. And they were asking about sandbags, and I'm just wondering if welfare checks have been done on these people to make sure that everything's okay for them, because we've got the River Chelt that goes right through our estates, and people were worrying. People were very worried about it. So. Thank you.
Suzanne, that's a really valid point, especially at the moment. But could we cover that at the end as kind of any other business? Because it kind of fits slightly outside. But thank you for bringing it up. Brilliant. So look, the next item, I'm just conscious that we should keep the agenda moving, otherwise we'll be here all night, is item 6, so the Q1 tenant satisfaction measures, known as the TSM, I didn't know that, tracker, update. So the objective of this, and I'm a market researcher by trade, so I find this stuff interesting, is feedback and insight from the Q1 phone surveys with tenants carried out on behalf of CBC by Acuity, they're the agency. These surveys provide our results for the perception-based tenant satisfaction measures. So it's about how people feel, so that's important. Caroline, would you like to take us through it? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. So obviously it's a very detailed report with an awful lot of data. So what I've drawn from it are really the headlines. And again, as this committee goes forward, you'll receive this data every quarter, so you'll be able to see the trends. I'm pleased to tell you at the moment that the trends for overall customer satisfaction are strong, and the council is in quartile 1 across housing providers. And the areas that are driving that overall satisfaction are we're seeing satisfaction above 80% in the time taken to complete repairs, which is always very important to our tenants, our ability to keep tenants informed, and our ability to treat tenants as they perceive fairly and with respect. that those are the positives that are coming from that customer satisfaction survey work. However, there are certain areas of improvement as well, and the clear areas we're taking from it is how we can evidence to our tenants that we listen to their views and act upon them, our approach to dealing with ASB, and our handling of complaints. For the latter two, it's interesting in that, as this is perception-based survey work, the people that are giving that feedback have not necessarily used those services. So it's quite challenging for us to figure out how we improve services for somebody who perhaps hasn't reported an ASB issue or hasn't made a complaint direct to the council. So alongside that, to make sure that we're delivering the best possible service, we are starting transactional surveys in October with those tenants who have used those services, so we can balance the perception with effectively the lived experience of using the services. And then we're also exploring a way of changing perceptions by improving our communication about our work around ASB and complaints, so tenants have got a better idea about the work that's going on in the background. So those are the two things. The other area that we definitely need to look at as a project across a number of teams is our performance in looking after communal areas. So that's the kind of focus. And again, I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you. I mean, I got a couple of comments about that. So as a market researcher, you know, I think actually perception-based measures are really, really important, because often people won't write in or they won't hang on the telephone to, you know, report an issue. So to have something that picks up how they feel is really important, because most people won't take actions to let you know. So that's really valuable. The points that you said about the 3 areas that needed more work made absolute sense to me. So the listening, how are you getting better at listening? Are you training people in that area? Because it's a skill and it's an attitude. So what are you doing in that area? The final thing for me was communal areas, I think, are really important because people can make their homes absolutely lovely and be really proud of their homes. But if the communal areas aren't great, you know, that they probably feel that kind of drags down their lovely home. So we've got a kind of duty there. So they were my questions for you.
So on the listening and acting upon views, obviously we get feedback from pretty much every contact. So whether that's a service request, whether that's a complaint, or indeed responding to this survey. So one of the things we do with every customer that comes back and says they're dissatisfied with something, we follow that up to try and change that perception. So there's a one-to-one conversation with every dissatisfied tenant that comes back from the survey. We're also working with our colleagues in comms to highlight the actions we take as a result to actually evidence that we're listening. So there's effectively a "you said, we did" section in every newsletter that goes out quarterly. And we're looking to build on that, and so that people can say, oh, actually they have taken notice, they have actually done something about that. But that's an incremental process. That will take time for those messages to land. And your second question about community areas, I absolutely agree with you. They are a fundamental part of a tenant's home, the area just around it. So, and we have helpfully had a tenant scrutiny on the same issue. So we've got a lot of recommendations come back from that scrutiny, which we will integrate with the dissatisfaction that we've received. And that's a piece of work going forwards to start to then action plan how we bring together the scrutiny recommendations with the other feedback that we've received.
So could we have a follow-up on the communal areas, maybe at some later point? I think that would be a really good thing. And, you know, if it's the problem is with flats more than with detached or semi-detached houses, and I can imagine it might be more in big blocks with flats, you know, think about those specific. So, Richard, do you want to?
Dean.
Oh, sorry, Martin, Dean Martin. It's
And just to add to it, Martin's my middle name, but just to highlight the regulator absolutely puts a real importance on that, because going forward, some of the performance reports you'll get to committee, where it's a failure in a communal area, it's no longer a single failure that we need to report. We need to report it as a failure times the number of flats in that block. So a block of 6 properties will be 6 failures when we report and not 1. So that's recognised in the regulations as well, the importance of communal areas being up to scratch.
Yes, still on communal areas. 2 of the comments, or 2 of the groups of comments, are grounds maintenance, grass cutting, and communal areas, rubbish storage areas. And for those, we are dependent on Ubico, I believe. Can you comment on how we, because these are the areas where I noticed that things slip. What's our relationship with Ubico like, and how can we help them be better?
So obviously we have effectively it's a client-contractor relationship because Ubico are providing a service. So this will be dealt with through fairly normal contractor meetings. They're very well wished and generally very responsive to areas of concern. But obviously we've got to keep working at this. So it's dealt with as contractor relationships through our performance management meetings.
I think Gareth would like to say something too.
Just to add to what Caroline said, I think it's worth pointing out that it's not necessarily always about the frequency of, say, collection of bin stores. Actually, it's the design of bin stores that is as critical as sometimes the service. Because if you get a bin store that's not laid out properly, it doesn't encourage sometimes them to be well kept, and so you can get complaints by the fact that the actual composition of the storage area isn't right, either for Ubico collecting it or residents using it. In terms of what I was going to make as a general point, and I think this is why I also think we can be optimistic about the conversations we can have at this committee. Is one of the key drivers that the administration chose to bring housing services in was to create efficiencies within the housing revenue account. And by doing and achieving a lot of the savings that we're achieving, I hope that can lead to positive conversations in this committee and as a council about where we choose to potentially reinvest in certain areas. So that can give more choice around how we look at communal areas, how we look at the standard of grounds maintenance, how we look at making investments in our properties that start to deliver on what tenants were telling us about that kind of what they're telling us through this survey. And I think that is a key point that we should remember as a theme going through these sorts of conversations, that we should take a note of and bring these sorts of issues back as we move forward.
Richard.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's I agree. That's all good. The actual thing that's the trigger for this that I've made notes on is the deep gouges left in the communal areas in the grass from all the roof replacement work. So that did a lot of damage to the green spaces around the flats, and none of it was fixed. So you've got, quite deep muddy puddles that are now full of litter from the bin stores around some of the flats. Now, Ubico cut the grass. Do they remediate the grounds as well? I don't know how that happens, but I reported it and nothing really happened.
If I can just come back, Chair, I think we'll take that outside of this meeting. My view is that it is likely a contractor that should make good in terms of the works that they've done, and Ubico wouldn't automatically just be in a remediation because they're working within the boundaries of their specification, which will be we do X, Y, and Z on this site. Nevertheless, we should address that sort of thing, and it's not acceptable that a contractor has not made good the area, and so that sort of intelligence is valuable because we can make sure that we pick it up and address it.
Ian.
Thank you, Chair. So the consultation that was carried out at the end of last year, beginning of this year, the 2 things that were really top of the agenda for residents were antisocial behaviour and communal areas, and that stood out quite a lot. In terms of antisocial behaviour, we cannot fix that on our own. it is about partnership, working with a lot of other agencies, the police, the courts, the mental health services, etc., etc. And I just wanted to ask, because the last time I was speaking to the antisocial behaviour unit, they had lost staff and those hours hadn't been replaced. And given that this is a top priority for our residents, I'm just concerned that we make sure we have the right resources and that we're putting the resources in. In terms of communal areas, before we received the news that CBH was being wound up, one of the last, and I think a very good suggestion from CBH, was that councillors, cabinet members, board members should actually go around and actually see for themselves. And that, I believe, was planned and was cancelled at the last moment. So I wonder whether there is value in actually doing that. From my experience, and I go around a lot of our housing stock, when the communal areas are managed well, it's very, very good. And when they're managed badly, it's terrible. So I think that's something that we might want to have a look at. The other point, and it was just a comment from a resident here in the thing, it feels like that we are annoying them if we ask for something to be done, as though we are ungrateful for our home. And I'm just put in mind, I don't know if anybody else saw the news conference by Sir Martin Moore-Bick when he produced his final report into Grenfell. One of the panel members was saying the new regulation should not be seen as more forms to fill in and more boxes to tick. This is about a change of culture. And when I first moved in to where I live now 13 years ago at Monkscroft, it was very much, well, you know, it's a social housing block. What do you expect? You know, if it's dirty, if people are frightened in their own homes because of antisocial behaviour, what do you expect? That's what social housing is. And that is the culture that we need to change. And I think I'm aware we are at a very crucial point here. We have an opportunity, I think, to do something really worthwhile and change that culture for our residents. Following the transition and the new work that is being done, I think that changing that culture so that people who live in social housing don't expect it to be bad and think, oh, well, shucks, that's the way the cookie crumbles. We actually say, no, you've got the perfect right to live in clean, well-maintained, decent housing. It's not, you're not asking for the moon, you're just asking for something that everybody should have.
Ian, your points are really well made, and I couldn't agree with you more. And in terms of the site visits, we've noted that down. In terms of, you know, what we were talking about earlier, Caroline, in terms of, you know, there's an attitude and there's a skill. And we all know when we ring people up, there are people who make you feel incredibly welcome and, you know, thanks for, you know, and there are people who make you feel like you should go away because you're a problem. So if we could think about that, and really that should be built into appraisals and things like that, I would suggest. And it's something we should be role modelling. One final thing, and then I'll bring Gareth in, was about the antisocial behaviour. For me, it's quite important to split antisocial behaviour from criminal behaviour. So playing your music loud is one thing, which is really annoying. Environmental health, you know, have to deal with it. And then there is criminal behaviour like graffiti, I would argue, which is criminal damage and so on. So Ian, you talked about the antisocial behaviour unit. Is there anything that we could be asking from the police?
I might be able to help with that.
Okay. Claire.
So I think just kind of related is last week we came together as a community safety partnership. So that's the council, the police, the county council, probation, a whole range of partners. We had a strategy day where we talked about what were going to be our kind of key 3 priorities moving forward as a community safety partnership. And we've agreed that one of those priorities, and this will come forward to council in due course for blessing, but one of the priorities we agreed should be around antisocial behaviour. So that is something that we are working at as a partnership across all of the relevant agencies. So that picks up all of those things that you're talking about, graffiti and that. And then Gareth's going to also just add something, because we're also doing some work around antisocial behaviour in terms of kind of a bit of what Suzanne was mentioning earlier. Sometimes you've got pockets where it's a mixture of tenures and all of those kind of things. So how we kind of make that a tenure neutral service, so it isn't separated out. So you get this service if you're a council house tenant, and you get a different service if you're a private resident. So we're doing some work on that, but I'll let Gareth talk a bit more about that.
So just to say, the administration has been very, very clear that responding to antisocial behaviour is a priority. So in terms of your question about resources, certainly no reduction in resources. Clearly it's administration decision about how we fund and set budgets, but I want to give that assurance that at this point, investing in antisocial behaviour retains as a commitment. The key thing that I just wanted to extend on what Claire said is, if you look back at the Cabinet report that was agreed about bringing housing services back into the council, was about improving our offer to all residents, and by treating everybody equally and offering that improved service. So it should automatically remove that sort of dividing line, whether you live in a CBC-owned social house, whether you live in a private home, you should have that welcoming offer. And as head of paid service on the cultural point, all again is I can commit my utmost in terms of the energies about where we want to take the culture of our new organisation as one, and that is to be people-driven, homes-driven, and not thinking about properties as a number, and not having any sense of the tenant or resident that there's any judgment or any attitude coming from the other side of the telephone or the desk, and that we will be offering and striving to provide that universal, welcoming, inclusive offer that recognises the importance of looking after our residents and everyone in our borough.
Thank you. Shall we go on to the next agenda item? Because I'm just kind of conscious. And Councillor Foster has joined us. So welcome.
Just apologise.
Of course. Don't worry, you're here. That's the main thing. So good to see you. So the seventh agenda item was Q1 2024, the Housing Complaints and Compliments Report. So the point of that report is to provide an overview of housing-related complaints and compliments from Q1. So it kind of complements, doesn't it, the market research that was done earlier. Identifying key areas of dissatisfaction and areas for learning and service improvement. Caroline, would you like to take us through it?
Thank you very much, Chair. So, as you alluded to, obviously the management and the handling of complaints in the social housing sector has transformed over the last 2 to 3 years. It was one of the key recommendations, obviously followed up in recent weeks from the Grenfell inquiry. So the Housing Ombudsman has had a substantial increase in resources and is in a position to bring a significant amount of governance to the management of complaints. And obviously, as a responsible landlord, we really welcome that. So we have to follow what's called a complaints handling code, and we have to self-assess against that annually. And we did that piece of work in June, and we've had approval from the Housing Ombudsman for that, and the complaints policy that sits alongside it. So that's the kind of context in which we're working in. Given the kind of national profile on complaints in social housing, we're still in an upward trend. As you can see from the report, we've received 71 complaints. But we've worked hard within the housing teams for colleagues to see those as positive and not necessarily a point of criticism or blame. So they are very, very much positioned as a point of learning and an opportunity to put things right. And as you can see, we're upholding the substantial number of the complaints that we receive, and we're working really hard on categorising the learning so we understand whether it's something that needs to happen across a team, an individual, or wider than that. The other point of interest is that we were encouraged alongside other housing providers to try and find a way of addressing the claims harvesting activity across Cheltenham, because potentially claims were going, solicitors were looking to make disrepair, to harvest disrepair claims, and then they'd take a substantial amount of any settlement made, with the tenant getting virtually nothing from the process. So tenants are more and more encouraged to use the council's housing complaints process to get fair redress for any issues that have gone wrong. And we're seeing a pleasing reduction in the number of disrepair claims that we're having to deal with through the courts. And the courts are actually really good partners in that. They're more directing disrepair claims back towards our complaints process. So in terms, again, without repeating myself and taking up too much time, communal areas is an area that's featured alongside what's coming through in dissatisfaction. There's a synergy in it coming through in complaints as well, and also in terms of customer contact. So our ability to respond to things at first point of request, or to make sure that we call back in a timely fashion. So those are the things that we're working on at the moment. In terms of our next steps, with Claire's help, we've already completed a stage 2 panel review. And as I mentioned earlier, our transactional surveys to get better services in complaints and in ASB are up and running from October. And again, happy to take any questions, of course.
Thank you. Any questions? Ian?
Forget I've got to turn this thing on. Just one very simple one. Having sat on stage 2 complaints panels in the past, do we have an update on what the composition of the panels will be post the transition?
So we've obviously, as you've been involved, you know, the panel was executive member, a board member, and a tenant representative. We received feedback from the Housing Ombudsman that the use that for it to be a senior member of staff with a cabinet member for housing to be kept informed, because obviously that person is also the member responsible for complaints. So we've gone to a senior officer review alongside that piece of information, because that's been established as best practice. The Ombudsman felt that the tenant involvement was potentially a conflict of interest. So that's why we've made that small change.
Any other questions? Thank you. The property compliance performance, so this is really important. The point of this is to provide the committee with an understanding of the compliance status as of the 31st of July 2024, and the planned improvements needed to address areas of non-compliance. Appendix provides an additional information relating to the management of fire safety specifically. So I know that Paul Leo isn't here, but Dean, am I right in saying you're happy to kind of pick up questions about this?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, and if I can, what I'm able to do is there are a number of places in the report where it mentions a verbal update can be given at the meeting, and I do have that update, so I'm happy to go through that first with the progress that we're making, and then to take any questions after that.
That would be really good. Could I ask, I mean, this is a kind of key area for us, so at the next meeting it would be really good if someone could be here, you know, and present it more formally. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So with regards to, I'm going to concentrate on those areas of compliance where we do have out-of-date actions and give an update on that. With regards to the fire risk actions, one of the elements we talk about in the report is we've done a review of the out-of-date actions, because some of them were recommendations, so didn't constitute a non-compliance as far as the legislation is concerned. We've taken those to one side. we haven't lost them or taken them away. We've put them on a separate list that we will pick up whilst we concentrate initially on making sure we're compliant with all the fire risk actions. That reduces the number to 139 compared to the numbers in the report. I'm going to break down those into what we call three strategic areas: fire doors, compartmentation and escape routes, and I'll cover them off one at a time. In terms of the fire doors, which also includes some window work, the outstanding actions are now 74 and not 89. And with all of those, contracts have now been placed, and the surveys have started. Where it requires a Section 20 process for some of the fire door replacements, that ran out today in terms of the process finished, and there were no inquiries to that. The challenge we have with the fire doors is, at the moment, because of demand around the sector, they're on a 4 to 8 week lead time. But we're still fairly confident, certainly with the high risk out-of-date actions, they'll be completed by December, because we've been doing the surveys in advance of the contract being placed and signed. So as soon as we've finished onboarding the contractors properly, checking their credentials and doing carrying out our duties as a client under the CDM regulations, then we can start that work, and we're confident the high risk ones will be done by December. We are interviewing tomorrow. We're bringing on board a specialist who's able to manage those works being done on site by the contractors, and they will hopefully join the team in the next few days after hopefully a successful interview tomorrow. In terms of compartmentation works, we're now at 57 and not 66 because we've completed some of them. So in all of these areas, they are coming down, and we're focusing on the high risk buildings and actions first. Works have been issued to the contractor for them to start to plan that work in. Again, we're mobilising that contractor. Once that's done, then in the next 2 weeks, we expect the works on site to commence. We are developing with, thanks to support from Claire, we're developing with the communication teams individual specific letters to all tenants whose properties are affected. We are absolutely concentrating, Flo, on the reading age of those letters and plain English in them. We wrote them as technical letters. We've now given it to the comms specialists, and they've done that work. The action I've taken from the conversation earlier is for us to double check whether any of those tenants need a translation of those letters prior to us sending them out in. So we'll carry that piece of work out from following this meeting. In terms of the escape routes, it's now down from 10 down to 8, and some of those are associated with the siting of the bin storage areas, and there are visits taking place this week to put in place the actions in order where we can move them and where we can move them to. So in terms of the out-of-date fire risk actions, we're on target for the actions as laid out in the report, and the numbers are coming down and trending in the right direction. In terms of the electrical checks and the 5-year checks, in the report it says 349, we're now down to 81. And that's coming down at a consistent rate. That would have given us a compliance rate of 99.25%. That wouldn't, but that's I call that that's a normal running level of compliance that we will always have somewhere we're struggling to gain access and that sort of thing. So that's that's down at a level. We have only one property where we have an outstanding check that's over 10 years old because the tenant's actually in hospital with a long-term illness, so it's difficult for us to gain access to complete that, but the property's not tenanted at the moment anyway because they're in hospital. So on the electrical checks, I think we're back down to what I'd say is a normal level, but we're continuing to work on the 81 to bring that down even further. On asbestos surveys and remediation contracts. Two things, both of those contracts have now been placed. One of them has been signed. We're waiting for the other to be signed. We expect that to happen tomorrow, signed here internally, and then work will start again in the next 2 weeks on carrying out the asbestos checks. Once again, we've onboarded the contractor properly within the compliance team to make sure we've got all the documentation in place ready for the work to take place. And finally, the other area is water. We're now down to 4 out-of-date actions instead of the 9 that was in the original report, mainly due to access of communal water tanks in loft spaces that was difficult. The last 4 of those are being completed this week, one of them this afternoon, and then we will be down to no out-of-date actions on the water side, and with all the evidence we need to demonstrate that, Chair, if we need to bring it to the next meeting. So that's an update on all the areas where we had out-of-date actions, and happy to take any questions.
I've got a few questions. It would be, we talked at the beginning about how this is people's homes. So I prefer to think about homes impacted rather than actions, if that makes sense. And I imagine some of these actions or outstanding actions impact multiple homes and some of them impact just one home. So it would be really useful to have a breakdown of the number of homes impacted by these areas, because I think that should be our key metric from now on, because we want as many homes to be fully compliant as possible. When you talked about escape routes as well and compartmentalisation, again, I couldn't understand if that was within single homes, compartmentalisation, or if that was in buildings with flats, for instance, which weren't properly compartmentalised. So again, just having some granularity around that. And escape routes, you know, you were talking about bins, but for me that ranged from having correct signage down to, do they need a whole new fire escape built on the edge of the building? So more granularity, I think, would be really helpful for us to understand it. When it came to fire, electrical as well, my understanding is that the law is much tougher on private landlords than it is on public housing landlords in terms of how often the electrical safety certificate has to be done. Am I correct in saying that?
You are correct, Chair. It's 5 years for private landlords. It will be introduced as 5 years for social landlords. We expect probably now early in the new year, but our own policy and what the regulator will look at is and ask the question of us, what's your own policy? Our own policy is moved towards a 5-year check, and that's the work that we've been doing, migrating from a 10-year check to a 5-year check.
Thank you. I mean, I'm strongly of the view that if it's important enough and good enough for private tenants, it's important enough and good enough for social tenants as well. So, yeah, if we can move towards that, that would be really good. But, yeah, the key thing for me is to more granularity, really understand what these things are and the number of homes. Sorry, Richard.
Yeah, I wanted to echo that. I was going to use different language. I need examples. I've asked a couple of times for but what does it mean, fire doors? We don't know. Is there a fire door there that's now old and needs replacing with one that's up to spec? I just don't know what that means. The compartmentation, I'm also unsure. And because that's external insulation, which sounds very Grenfell to me, I'd really like to know what that is exactly, if possible.
So a couple of things. One is that granularity does exist. So when we do the next report, we can attach it so that and break it down and summarise it in some way, and we can develop that as the meetings go on. The fire doors, it's a combination of it's a door that doesn't meet the standard or the door's been damaged, and so in some instances we need to repair the door. In some instances we need to replace it with a full door set, and in some instances it's because we don't have the full certification associated with it, and we need to have a certified door set in there. So it's to bring it to a standard where we can evidence that it's a door in place that we know meets the standard. So there was a combination of all of those, but that granularity does exist. In terms of compartmentation and cladding, we don't have any cladding here of that sort that we need to deal with. The compartmentation tends to be, and I was looking at some of the reports earlier, it's where in a cupboard or a riser we've got pipes, electrical cables, and that's sort of running through it, and or a tenant's run an electrical extension and put a hole in the wall and it's not been sealed properly, where we can't certify that it's been done properly, and we need to go in. We've had a compartmentation survey done on each of the blocks. We need to go in and replace that with intermescent sealant that we know is up to standard and do that work. So it's in general, it's the compartments within the building to stop the spread of fire if there is one. So they're most of the actions. But again, we can summarise those in a table for you, so you going forward, so you can see what the level of the works required, because some of them are quite minor and some of them are significant compartments that need redoing.
Dean, if you could think about how to make this committee experts, so that would be really, words of one syllable, break down everything, don't assume knowledge. That would be really good, because we want to give you a run for your money in your job,
Absolutely. And if in between meetings, we want to sit down and have some of those sessions where we can train and brief and bring you up to speed on it, more than happy to do that work, and have done so with similar local authorities.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Richard.
Sorry, just to come back on that, you could attach the report, but there's already a lot of reading, and I would have been satisfied with just a few sentences that described it. It doesn't describe it. The sentence here that I was trying to ask about, 3 actions relate to undertaking further survey on external wall insulation. So not inside cupboards. What is this external wall insulation?
There is some insulation on some of the properties. It is my understanding is it's not of the type that the aluminium-based cladding that was used in Grenfell, but because the types of surveys we'd done previously weren't intrusive, and for us to make absolutely sure there are no issues with it, we're doing intrusive surveys to make, because sometimes it's the way it's installed and what's behind it, and so they're doing the intrusive surveys just to reassure ourselves.
Ian.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just 3 questions really on 3 different areas. In terms of fire, I was interested to read in the report that we have so many of these outstanding actions because we chose to do more in-depth fire risk assessments. So I think that should be borne in mind. The thing that I was interested in, again coming from the final report into the Grenfell tragedy, in terms of escape routes and evacuation, if you have a building which satisfies the requirements, that's not to say that the people living in it, say you have somebody living on the 2nd floor who has mobility issues, they may still not be able to get out. And so if we're looking at homes and focusing on the residents and the people, one of the recommendations that came from that inquiry was that we look at not is the building safe, but are the people who live in it safe? So I just wanted to make that point. In terms of gas, I'm looking at page 65 here, page 1 of the Appendix 1 Property Compliance KPI report. So properties with capped gas, 140, 42 tenanted homes, and then over the page it says we have 80 voids, which are also capped. That leaves 18 properties unaccounted for. So do we know we've got 80 voids and 42 tenanted properties with capped gas, what's happening with the other 18? And in terms of the tenanted properties with capped gas, I read that it is handed over to tenancy management to look after those tenants. But are these properties considered compliant because their gas is capped? If they haven't got a gas safety certificate? And what is actually happening to these tenants? Are they having their gas capped because they can't afford to pay their bill? Are they in fuel poverty? Do they have disabilities so that they're not letting people in to do the safety checks? So are we keeping an eye on the 42 families potentially who are in these properties? And finally, in terms of asbestos, again, we are on page 7 of that appendix. Under the new contract, the third-party contractor will host the asbestos register together with a portal, providing improved access to asbestos information for CBC and its contractors. In addition, the contractor would provide plain English reports for residents on asbestos within their homes. How does that square with the desire to bring all of our information into QL if somebody else is going to be hosting the asbestos register? And what is happening at the moment, as I know that we're saying that asbestos surveys should be complete by 2027, if we have survey information about domestic properties at the moment, how are tenants being informed if they have asbestos in their properties? Sorry.
Yeah, so just to, I might need to come back and ask you what the first one was, but sorry, apologies. So start with the, so certainly with the gas checks and the capped properties, Carol and I met this morning so we can give an update on what the, we need to provide an update outside the meeting on how we are working with and managing the tenants, because that's a significant number compared to what I found in other places where we've capped and they're tenanted over 3 months, and what the issues, if there are any issues, because also we're coming into a period where then that will seriously impact damper mould and all of those things. So with regards to the LGSR, there's a requirement to do the LGSR, whether it's capped or not. If there's a gas supplied to that property, we still have to do the LGSR, so that will still be done. So just to reassure you, but we identify them as capped for all the reasons that we talked about in terms of the tenancy management. I don't know where the gap in the numbers comes, so I'll come back and confirm that. So apologies for not knowing the detail of that. In terms of the asbestos, there is work, it's part of the conversation we're having as to which bits of information from the asbestos surveys do we then bring into QL so that we have asbestos information held on the property record associated with on QL, so that we can know which property. Most of the properties here are of an age where they may well have asbestos in them anyway. In terms of how we feed that back to existing tenants in the 51%, we do have a management survey on. I don't know, so I'll ask that question and come back to you and confirm it. In terms of going forward, that is part of the new contract that will provide a plain English summary to them. I think the question you're asking from the first one, or certainly to cover one of the things you asked, Ian, was in terms of, I was at the inaugural Building Safety Regulator conference, and they said, know your building and know your tenants, and as long as you know them both and the risks of that tenant in that building, you won't go far wrong. We are absolutely doing a lot of work on how we understand what and as part in each of the blocks, and putting together our premise information that includes tenant information. So where we've got tenants who can't self-evacuate in the case of a fire, then we've got that information ready to provide. And part of that is how we engage more frequently with the tenants, because it's okay doing that at allocation, but of course people live in our properties for a significant period of time and become and sort of get mobility issues while they're tenants. So it's making sure our engagement with them is sufficient to be able to identify if they develop issues going forward, that there might either means we have to put in place specific actions for them in case of a fire, or indeed if it means the property is no longer appropriate for them and we need to move them to a ground floor. So that absolutely is on the work that's being done as we develop our information against both the tenants and the homes they live in.
Yes.
I think I know the answer to the asbestos question about current homes. So I think what happens at the moment, but we will double check this, is if there's a survey done, that the tenant is just literally given a copy of the whole assessment, which clearly most people won't necessarily understand. So that's the piece of work that Dean is talking about, is that making sure that actually when we're giving tenants this information, that we're clear about what it actually means for them and what they can do and what they can't do and that sort of thing. But at the moment, I think they're just getting a full copy of the assessment, so probably just not understanding it. And just to add to what Dean was saying as well about the work around understanding our tenants. So as part of our improvement plan, which Caroline said earlier, we will start bringing into this committee so you can track that. We have identified a piece of work around tenancy audits, so really understanding all of our tenants. We've got quite a bit of information, particularly around people that are in sheltered housing, but not so much around people that are in general needs. So tenancy audits is an ongoing piece of work as well. So just to add to that.
Could I just add a suggestion to what you're saying? Because I mean, obviously people's health changes all the time,
Yeah.
and you could have a stroke, for instance,
Yeah.
and should we be encouraging people to contact
Yeah, we will.
CBC in an active way
Yeah.
if their health changes and they become
That's
immobile?
part of that bigger piece of work around tenancy audit.
Brilliant, thank you.
You asked a question about fire actions and about a delay in the completion of fire actions to make further investigation. Was that the first part of your question?
No, I was asking about evacuations, as in for the people, rather than for just making the building compliant. Are we actually ensuring that the people can get out? The other part of it was just to say that I understand that we have a large number of outstanding fire actions because we've chosen to do more thorough inspections. That was what was in the report that we had.
That in the sense that we chose with the last round to do some type 3, which is more intrusive, so identifies more action, where the requirement is actually only to do a type 1. That's absolutely true, Ian. Yeah, absolutely. The other piece is we're coming up to the time when we redo the fire risk assessments. One of the challenges from the previous one was that they all ended up being done in a short space of time, which meant that the deadline to complete the actions was also, as a result of that, all done in a very short space of time. Very difficult to deliver then. And so what we are doing is we're actually bringing them forward. So from January next year, we'll be doing them in a phased basis, so that we'll be getting the actions from it in a phased basis, and that means we're doing a number of them early, and to give us then our ability, not setting ourselves up to fail again.
Thank you. So next agenda item, and I'm afraid, Dean, it's you again, under the spotlight for this, is the stock condition survey, so knowing our properties. So the point of that was to raise awareness of existing issues with out-of-date stock condition surveys, and the impact this has had on compliance with the consumer standards and the actions being taken to resolve this issue. So everything's intertwined. I imagine there'll be overlap there, but if you could talk us through that, thank you.
Yeah, just to give an update, absolutely right. One of the requirements of the consumer standards is that we have up-to-date knowledge of our stock. The regulator deems that to be a physical check, at the most every 5 years of that property. That stock condition work, there's been a lot of work. RAND have been appointed as a contractor to undertake that work. We've been developing the questionnaire so that the work, as they collect it, can go straight on to QL. That work has now been completed, and I'm delighted to say the survey goes live next Tuesday. So we've done some test properties, but the stock condition survey will go live next Tuesday. There is a piece of work that we started last week with a workshop where we have to take some strategic decisions ourselves onto how we gather and store information on the blocks as well as on the individual properties within a block. We completed that work last week in a workshop. That piece of work is now the focus. Now the survey form for the individual properties is going live because our next target is as soon as possible to get a representative sample of 20% of the surveys done, which includes the blocks, as soon as possible, so that we can use it to feed the asset strategy in the 30-year HRA business plan, and 20% is the size of sample we need in order to be able to do that for it to be a significant enough sample size to be able to base that planning on. But also we shall then use the findings from the 20% to focus on which areas of the stock do we go to next in terms of the stock condition work, because if the first 20% highlights a particular issue in a type of archetype or a particular area, then we will go to those first and complete the stock condition work in those properties first. With the plan still to complete all of them by the end of this financial year. So next, yeah.
Thank you. So this is a geeky question from a market researcher. How do you define a representative sample?
But in this instance, because it's so accepting everything you've said about homes and that sort of stuff, absolutely, it's by archetype. It's by archetype and by age and size of property.
Mean?
So yeah, flat, bungalow, house, that sort of thing.
So it's by age and property type?
Yes.
Okay. Other questions? Ian?
Yes, you've answered all the questions I was going to ask. I just wanted to say that I got my letter from Gareth today informing me of the plan to do the stock condition survey. So that arrived on my doormat today. So very, very well timed. And I can assure you it is in plain English. So thank you very much.
But not audio. That's to come.
Can we present that as evidence, Chair, that the process is working?
Brilliant. Excellent. Excellent.
No, thank you. I just about managed to read it.
Any more stock condition questions? No? Okay. Then we're on to the housing revenue account, known as the HRA, the budget monitoring report. So Q1 from 30th of June 2024 it was done. So the purpose of it is to provide a monitoring position statement for the HRA against the budget approved by Council on 23rd of February 2024, highlighting any key variances. So the money is important. So Stafford Cruise, Gemma is going to do it. Thank you, Gemma. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So I've just made a note here of the comment about how we make the committee experts. So for those of you who aren't aware, so when we talk about jargon in local government, HRA stands for the Housing Revenue Account. So that's a budget that's completely separate to our general fund budget. The HRA is all expenditure related to housing, and it's funded by rents and service charges, where the general fund is basically everything else, and it's funded by council tax and business rates. So in the same way that we talk about our general fund balance, which is sort of our rainy day fund, we've also got a HRA balance. So when we're reading this report, the sort of target HRA balance, so when we've made surpluses each year, as we accrue that, the target is £1.5 million. So what we've got here for Q1 is how we're forecasting that the HRA budget will perform based on all of the income and expenditure that have gone through in the first quarter of the year. And you'll see that we've got some variances both on income and expenditure. Some of these relate to external factors, so interest rates, which still remained high in the first quarter of the year, and some relate to the compliance work that we've been discussing this evening. So most of those to date have been offset by some of the savings we've made by bringing Cheltenham Borough Homes staff in-house to the council and combining those senior management teams. But to be clear, I think what's really important to stress in this report is that as an organisation, we're committed to doing everything that we have available within our budgetary framework to make sure that the teams that are driving forward with this work have the resources they need to do that. So that means if we need to free up resource to make sure that we can continue to invest or reinvest in some of those activities. So you'll see then again from the report that there's been a change in the bottom line in the way we're funding our capital programme. So on the HRA side, there would normally be a revenue contribution which would be made to fund some of the capital works. We're not going to do that this year. That revenue budget will be held centrally so that we can invest those resources in the work that's needed to make sure we're funding that improvement plan. So happy to take any questions.
Should?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, my thanks to Stafford for another great report. It is quite complicated always to follow this and to get through it, but I've had plenty of practice now. I think it's 3 years I've been looking at these. So we get our rent in, which is a social rent, so it's a lower rent, and then we spend all of that on these various programs, capital programs, and inside this HRA ring fence, basically. So all of the rent goes back into the housing, pretty much. There were two items that stood out to me when I saw that that we weren't funding any capital revenue. We weren't funding any capital from revenue, and that was that to stay on track. Sometimes it's important to spend. It's not always about saving. So to stay on track with the new build, we need to build 320 Swindon Road or get started and keep Monkscroft on track. Now, I know that the Monkscroft development, they've stopped their public consultation. I was just wondering whether or not we will end up spending that money this year or whether it's looking like that's now going to stretch out.
I think maybe we take that specific question about Monkscroft offline because I just need to double check with the development team on that. But I know that within the capital programme there is flex. So the capital programme that was approved in February was a 4-year programme. So in the same way as the general fund capital programme, where there's slippage in programmes, we would ask for that budget to be carried forward. So just to reassure you that if we don't spend it, it doesn't mean it's disappeared. We would look to carry that budget forward into future years if those programmes were to slip.
Can I come back? So this is also driven by my questions are also driven by the fact that in CBH we used to see the new build programme, and I'm no longer sure where that's happening within the council. So if somebody could clarify where that is, because it doesn't seem to be on the forward work plan for this committee.
That'll sit with the major developments and regeneration team that we brought together in terms of that pipeline. And as they previously reported to a previous CBH board, I'm sure at your discretion that could be placed on the work plan and they can give an update on pipeline projects and where we are in terms of that progress.
That would be good. Ian.
Thank you. Yeah, like Richard, I've seen more than my fair share of these, and after 3 years, I've just about managed to wrap my head around them. I just wanted to ask about the chart on page 92 under the executive summary. I don't know if it's possible to get that up on the screen, so you don't have to look at me, you can look at the chart. It's page 92.
That's not in this report.
Oh, it might be an appendix. HRA management accounts, sorry.
93. Yeah.
It's this one with the blocks on it. Oh, it's on 94 for you, it's 92 for me. That's it, yeah, okay. So we've got different numbering systems, that's all. So I understand that we anticipate the budget surplus of 356,000 and that the forecast is now down to 255. I understand that there is an increase in the repairs budget because of agency staff, etc. I don't know where the other 50,000 has come from. It says other, but I wonder if we could actually have some idea what that 50,000 is. The other thing that was surprising to me is that we've made £400,000 of staff savings, and yet all of that seems to have been used to pay down debt, which is on page 95 for me, but probably even page 97 for you, interest payable. So the entire saving made by consolidating the two teams and savings of staff has been used for that one thing, and that surprised me a little, that we weren't using any of that to invest in some of the priorities that residents have made clear that they have. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that particular chart and explain to us why this decision has been taken, and will that money that we've saved in terms of interest be then used in future to invest in residents' priorities?
Yes, absolutely. So where the HRA Capital Programme in previous years has been funded by borrowing, so that borrowing is done, or had been done historically, by the council, and then a loan made to the HRA. So that interest cost was passed to the HRA. Now, the proportions of the programme that have been funded by borrowing have increased and did increase last year. So that obviously then has a knock-on effect for the cost of the interest costs for 24-25. In addition to that, there was an expectation that interest rates, the fixed rates that we can borrow from the Public Works Loan Board would reduce, and it's taken a lot longer than we expected for that to happen. It's now happened, they've now fallen 80 basis points, and we're starting to fix some of that debt, but we have been holding that debt in sort of temporary deals at slightly higher levels, so that when those rates fall for fixed deals, we can switch that borrowing and make that saving. So it is expected to be sort of a one-off cost pressure this year until we get that debt fixed. Those budgets will be freed up, and we can start to reinvest in some of the priorities we've been talking about this evening as the administration wants.
The, sorry, and the other £50,000 that was marked as other?
Can I take that question away and get back to you?
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
So just an observation, I saw that there's 11.1 million for insulation over 3 years. I was pleased to see that, and I did check, and we have got it in there under the capital programme, social housing decarbonisation, 3.29 million. So I'm pleased to see that. But I think we have a commitment to hit net zero by 2030. So we're going to have to get our skates on, because that takes us to 2028, doesn't it? So something's got to give for those last 2 years if we're going to get all the houses insulated. It's an observation.
No, it's a really good point. It's a really good point. Thank you. Okay, so the next item is Agnieszka, if you're okay, because Bazina isn't here, shall we suspend that and leave it and you give an update maybe after the meeting? Or are you happy to do it on your own? Well, look, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thanks.
I wrote some introduction, but I think we can skip that one. As this is our first meeting, I would like to share a few bullet points about what we have done so far. Since April, we have supported the transition to CBC and looked at a recommendation from the Campbell-Tickner report. Had an update on customer standards report, reviewed and given feedback on the fencing policy, and we also reviewed and given feedback on the single equality scheme. After the summer break, we have come back together and we will be launching into a scrutiny on complaints handling code. If you'd like more information, please let me know and I will provide a detailed report for you.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I imagine that you were doing it from the tenant perspective and that Bozena was going to do it from the leaseholder perspective. Brilliant. Okay, so maybe the ask is to Bozena after the meeting to send through what she would have presented. But we've got half of it, which is brilliant. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Excellent. So any questions for Agnieszka? That's because it's so brilliant. So thank you. Point is the review of the committee work plan. So there's nothing to say really as such, unless you think we should be changing it or tweaking it or adapting it, and key priorities. So Claire's got some.
Yeah, no, just to flag, obviously, your next meeting, there was obviously a couple of changes from this one. You've got a policy coming for you to consider and hopefully then recommend on to cabinets. That's the fencing policy. You'll also start seeing that improvement plan that we've talked about earlier, so you'll be able to start tracking that. And also at the next meeting, we're also going to start bringing you a specific housing risk register, so you'll also be able to look at risks around housing and start asking some questions around that. And I've captured some notes to bring something, add something into the work plan, which we can liaise with you, Chair, but when we want to do that, around the work around communal areas and that sort of build and strip development plan and that sort of pipeline of development. So I've added those on as additions.
And tying all those actions down to actual homes.
Yes.
So numbers
Yes.
of homes
Those,
which
yeah.
are impacted.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so.
Hand up.
Oh, Richard.
I did have 2 comments. I already made one of them. That was I didn't see the new supply in here, and I've got a commitment to provide something around that. The other thing is the fencing policy. I haven't seen it yet, But in view of us declaring a nature emergency, I very much hope that the fencing policy includes some encouragement to use hedging instead of wooden fencing and concrete. I've locally to me, I've seen a 96-year-old hedge ripped out and replaced by fencing around a CBH property a few years ago. And I did stop them when they started on the front garden, but it seems a nonsense to be doing that. So considering the current need for wildlife. Thank you.
I think you're spot on, Richard. And, you know, in terms of our SPD that we did about biodiversity and planning and so on, I think it's all relevant from that point of view. Yeah. So hedges are fantastic. If not hedges, fences are better, you know, if not hedges. And they can be hedgehog friendly and so on. The worst option is having concrete or something that nothing can get through. So, Ian.
Yeah, just on the housing risk register, I noticed when I reviewed this that it's only in November and it doesn't seem to reappear at any other point. So are we going to be reviewing it more regularly than once a year? And just a personal interest, do we know when the new sector risk profile is being published? Because it was November last year. Which I have, but obviously we'll have a new one coming out soon. November, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next item is, we're almost there, is items to be referred to Cabinet. No items are scheduled to be recommended to the Cabinet. We could, if we wanted, take anything out of this meeting and say we would like Cabinet to look at it, but I haven't picked that up from you. So are we all in agreement? Nothing to be referred. Briefing note. We all got a briefing note that I personally found very helpful on recent developments in the housing sector and providing opportunities for kind of horizon scanning, so things that we can do in the future. Has anyone got any observations that they'd like to share about that? No? Okay, brilliant, thank you. Oh, Ian, brilliant.
Yeah, I did notice, and it wasn't clear before, that the plan to reform the leasehold system has survived the change of government. It wasn't entirely sure that it was going to. Fortunately, we don't have our leaseholder representative here, but it might be worth looking at that and how it affects our leaseholders. Also, the plan to outlaw no-fault evictions has also survived the change of government, which is very welcome.
Yeah, I think they're both great points, and yeah, we could schedule something in on both of those, couldn't we?
Yeah, and obviously we've got a leaseholder panel now as well, so
Yes.
we can look at that.
Now, Richard.
Sorry again. I notice also that there's a consortium, including NatWest, British Gas and Places for People, is piloting a new financial model aimed at retrofitting up to 1,000 social homes with energy efficiency upgrades and low carbon heating. When I thought about it, they're probably talking about housing associations rather than council housing, but yes, you're nodding. Okay, thank you.
We haven't got an AOB here, but I do know exactly that Suzanne wanted to talk about, you know, what we're doing to protect properties now, and given the urgency of it and timeliness of it. Would someone be able to, Suzanne, do you want to lead on?
Just say it's particularly where I live, because we got the River Chart goes through, and it was very scary, particularly on Friday, and it was amazing how quickly it went off afterwards. But then it was getting back again Sunday, right up at one point the river was coming across Princess Elizabeth Way rather than going under the bridge or anything, because there wasn't any bridge left. It was just straight across the way. And I'm particularly worried about the tenants. There are, I think I was trying to think of about six bungalows that face towards the river, and obviously being bungalows, they are probably vulnerable tenants for one reason or another. I just want to know, make sure that somebody's actually checking on them to see if everything's okay. Yeah, but obviously there are other properties as well, but I think particularly about those bungalows.
Thank you. Good point. Gareth, we'll put that.
So I'd like to just offer my thanks to all those offices that sort of support those properties that were affected over the last weekend, because we Caroline and her teams were out supporting residents. My suggestion would be we are expecting heavy rain later in the week, so if you can inform us via Caroline, and we'll make sure that there's local intelligence to us is important, so we can maybe think about any precautionary measures. What I was really impressed with in terms of the council's response across our housing and across all the corporate properties was the speed at which we responded and were supporting tenants. So I'm confident that we've got the right system in place, but of course any intelligence of that ilk, please send it to Caroline and the team.
Suzanne?
What I was asked about today was sandbags, because obviously the parish councils around about are providing sandbags or helping people with sandbags, but I said we haven't got a parish council, so no.
Gareth, are you okay to comment on sandbags?
So we don't tend to have a service where we're giving out sandbags to individual properties. We tend to have strategic reserves that we then deploy as part of our kind of emergency response. However, I think what we'll do is let's just have the conversation outside of the meeting with Caroline and the team, and then we'll work to see what we can do to support residents.
Yeah, I would just like to say also, in terms of residents, volunteers, including the Monkscroft Action Group that I chair, on Friday evening, we had several properties where the water was about 1 centimetre away from entering their property's ground floor flats. And we had about 10 resident volunteers, myself included, up to our knees in flood water, dragging detritus out of drains to get the water flowing. We've noticed that a number of those drains now are blocked from all the sediment and everything that has been washed down into them. We had an incident about 10 days earlier where we'd had a flood due to builders' rubble in one of the drains, which we called out the out-of-hours service and was cleaned, and that didn't flood. So I think I will feed back through to Caroline that some of the drains, I know the sewerage in parts of Cheltenham is prehistoric, and that before the next lot of rain comes down, we really need to make sure that some of these drains are clear and actually are working.
Richard, Flo?
It feels very much to me like we need to be looking at flooding as a, like we've got the big six, we probably need to look at flooding as well.
Yeah.
I think we could have that as a kind of work group, couldn't we, actually? Can we come back about that? It does sound, think about how we would do it. It does sound sensible. Flo?
Just a quickie to finish with, if I may, Chair. You mentioned flooding, and we've heard what happened. I'd like to ask Caroline to take back thanks to the officers who, you will know, at Robert Harvey House, which is sheltered accommodation. The lift was completely out because of the flooding. There was a lot of flooding in there. And the officers from our team went and they carried shopping up for the residents. They made sure they weren't slipping. They were actually ensuring that they were safe in their homes. And I think that is probably just one example of what officers were doing. But it's an example that came to me because residents were so grateful for the work that those officers did. So it's just to say a thank you.
So thank you. And thank you, Caroline.
It's something that you wouldn't get everywhere, but we got it here. So
Thank you to Caroline and her team. Also, thank you to community-minded people like Ian, who get stuck in there and do it for the good of all of us. You know, it's so thank you for everyone. You know, for what you've done. So look, dates of next meetings. So one thing is we've got more training, and I thought the first training session was really good actually, and I really enjoyed it. So we've got another one on Tuesday the 15th at 5 o'clock, which I assume will be done remotely again by Zoom or whatever. But thank you for that. That was really good, and we should all try to attend it because we can learn stuff. And then the next meeting itself is on the 13th of November at 6 o'clock for the committee. And as I say, this is a work in progress. Yeah. So officers, thank you very much for everything. As a committee, we aim to get more demanding rather than less demanding, but in a really constructive and positive way. That's okay.